and welcome to Murphy's Garden. This is a bit of a different format. I'm in the kitchen today and we're doing our first Q&A, just a short Q&A about pleached trees. Now, as you know, we put these pleached trees in ourselves, having had no experience of it beforehand. And I've had lots of comments about this, just asking various questions, and I thought it would be quite beneficial just to share some of these questions. I don't claim to be an expert. My only experience is that we put them in ourselves, we planted them, and we've cared for them and looked after them over the last 8 years, when we put our first row in. And I think the best way of really getting to know any plant is to actually live with it, see it throughout the seasons, and find out all its little foibles and things. A bit like people, really. You really get to know a person when you live with them. And plants are the same, so you get to know all the little ways, the good points, the bad points, and everything in between. So we'll just share this with you, and we'll answer some of the questions. Okay, so the first question was asking all about what are the legal implications of planting a pleached hedge near a neighbouring property. In our case, this wasn't a big issue because although we are overlooked by a neighbouring property, the neighbour isn't directly next to us. There's a driveway that runs between our house and their house. So for us, it wasn't really a big issue. However, it is a really good question because often pleached hedges are planted deliberately to block out a view from a neighbouring property. So I think before we get on to the actual legal implications, I think the best thing to say is that if you possibly can, before you get into any councils and lawyers and anything like that, if you can avoid all of that, that is the best way. And the best thing to do is to speak to your neighbours if you've got a good relationship with them, or even if you don't know them, is to pop round next door, show them pictures of what you're hoping to do, what your proposal is, and just ask them how they would feel about it. You might find when they see what it is you're doing, they might think, this is going to benefit their side too, and obviously they won't have any of the workload, but they'll get the look. So you might find that they're perfectly amenable and it's not a problem, in which case you can go ahead without any worries. As regards to the legal implications, I'm not a lawyer, but however my big sister is, so I have had a quick chat with her about it, and she agrees that when it comes to any neighbourhood disputes, the only people that ever win are the lawyers. You're far, far, far better to work with your neighbours, and if they're really unhappy about you doing it, then don't even go there, and consider what the implications will be for them. Because if you're going to plant a 12-foot size pleached hornbeam or any pleached trees, what's the light levels going to be like? How will it affect? Where does the sun come up? Where does the sun go down? How will it affect their side of that? And will it cast their whole garden? If they've only got a small garden, you could be potentially casting their whole garden in shade. And so quite reasonably, they may not want you to do this. So that's the best way forward. Now, as far as legality goes, I think the main thing, having had a chat with Karen, legally in the UK, any non-growing boundary such as a fence should not exceed 2 metres, but any living boundary isn't restricted. The issue with pleached hedges is that trees essentially don't require planning permission, or don't require permission, but potentially the frame, as it's over 2 metres and it is a structure, might bring you within the scope of planning. However, it would take a neighbour reporting you to planning, and the enforcement action is optional on the part of the local authority, and they may view the structure as lightweight and temporary and therefore not a problem. However, you don't even want to go there. I think if you can get the neighbour's consent, then that's obviously absolutely the best way. The other thing you will require neighbours' consent with as well, because if you're planting right up to the boundary line, you will need access at least once a year to get in there and just cut the hedge and just the general maintenance. So it would really help if you've got their consent. If you can't get the neighbour's consent, then it may be necessary to consider other options, some of which we'll come on to in the next question. And the next question I had was just about the spacing of planting pleached trees, This person had 5 Carpinus, betulus, fastigiata, which were standard trees, but which they wanted to plant along a fence line with the view to pleach them onto a framework. The fence was 8 foot wide and 6 foot in height. Initially, when I got this question, I got carried away with a very lengthy answer all about the spacing and the technique, etc., which I sent. That was on a Friday. The following morning, it was Saturday, and over breakfast, I happened to mention to Alistair the following day. I read the question to him and the advice that I had given just to get his view, and he immediately pointed out, but they're fastigiate trees, and I'm like, oh, this is an absolute case of me not reading the question properly, and I quickly replied, giving quite different advice. The word fastigiate means upright, so any plant with the word fastigiate or fastigiata means that it has a habit of growing up rather than lateral growth. And if we look at this in the context of yew, so we've got lots of yew growing in our garden, and this is Taxus baccata, and we use it for producing really bushy hedges around the garden. It can also be used for topiary and cutting into all sorts of shapes and sizes. But we also have got Taxus baccata fastigiate, which is also known as Irish yew. And we actually in the summer went to County Fermanagh in Northern Ireland, and we saw the original site of the first Irish yew and why it's called Irish yew, because that's where it comes from, County Fermanagh. And it was noticed that this particular tree, instead of growing like other yew trees outwards, it seemed to display this sort of upright habit, and so it was used to produce more trees with that habit. So in the case of Carpinus betulus, Carpinus betulus fastigiata wants to grow upwards, and left to grow naturally, it will grow into this kind of flame type of shape. It looks absolutely beautiful. It looks really lovely. But if you are choosing a Carpinus betulus tree for pleaching, it's probably best not to get the fastigiate or fastigiata version, but rather without that word after it, because that means it will grow and will have lateral growth, and that's what you want when you're pleaching. You want the growth to go outwards. In the case of this chap, he'd already bought his trees. He'd bought 6 trees, and they were the fastigiata variety. So I don't know how they would fare in pleaching. He was intending to go ahead and pleach them anyway, and probably they will be fine, because the action of pleaching, you're pulling back these branches and fastening them to the framework, and they're trees. They want to grow, they want to survive, they want to thrive and do well, so probably they would be absolutely fine. But it's just something to consider, and I think if you've got a choice between the two, then don't get the fastigiate version. And the fastigiate version, incidentally, is a fabulous tree, and for those of you who perhaps don't want to do the whole faff of pleaching, and it is a lot of work, so perhaps you don't want that, but you do want the look that Hornbeam gives to a garden. The lovely autumnal colours can be absolutely beautiful, so this might be something to consider. And we also, when we talked about in the first question about issues with neighbours and planting close to neighbours, this might be something to consider, because you can plant these trees and they form this sort of candle-like shape, and that can be good at blocking out a view if you plant it in strategically in front of whatever the thing that you want to block out, and plant it in front of that, and it's absolutely stunning. Now Alistair goes to a lady who's got them growing in her garden, which I'll show you. This is it here. It's a very contemporary garden, and in fact, as a garden, it would be really lovely if we could actually visit, because it's quite a different garden. It's absolutely lovely, and these trees have been used to really good effect. So definitely worth a consideration if you don't want to go down the whole process of pleaching. The fastigiate form looks lovely growing naturally, but it can also be clipped tight to form these blocks of dense hedging and used to block out a specific view. And look, you can also grow them into pyramids as well. So let's go back and answer the original question, which was about the spacing of planting pleached trees. So I've been asked 2 questions. The first one was, what distance apart should the trees be planted? Now in the UK, standard fence panels are 6 foot wide. The question I had was from the US, and the fence panel was 8 foot wide and 6 foot high. So I would always advocate, because I think it looks better, is to plant the tree in the middle of the fencing panel. And you do that for two reasons. Number one, it looks best, it looks more balanced. Obviously, if they're 8 foot apart, if the panels are 8 foot apart, then it will take a little bit longer for them to knit together, but it will knit together in the long run, and I think it will look better. But of course, the other reason is that if you plant them near the post, and the post, if it's wooden, eventually rots, it will need to be replaced. Or if anything happens, you've got wind against a fence, and eventually the concrete can rock, and sometimes it has to be redone. So if you do have to dig down to make a new post, then you potentially might damage the roots of the tree. So I think it's best just to keep well away from the concrete. And the other reason, of course, is that you want the roots to go down and get moisture and nutrients, and to be away from the concrete where they're not going to get that. Oh, and the other thing I would say with that as well, so even if it is an 8 foot fence, and the video I've done is all about making them sort of, the bamboo structure was using, I think, 5 foot bamboos. But even if you continue to do that exactly as I did in the video, but all you do is when you come to join them all together, just put bamboos between each of the structures, so the whole thing joins together as one. So it's not an issue. You can make them, adapt them according to your situation. Now, if you're not planting in front of a fence and you want a speedier result, you could go closer. Our limes, which aren't in front of a fence panel, are planted 4 foot apart. However, I think we maybe planted them a bit too close, and I think 5 foot would probably be better. And that would just give each tree its own space. I think ours were a wee bit too close together, and one of the reasons for that is because when we planted them, they were teeny tiny little saplings, and it was really, really hard to imagine them ever being big. So, but don't make that mistake. Just space them out well, and the way you want them to be in their final position, because they will grow really quick. The other question about spacing was, what distance from the boundary should the trees be? I think the answer to this depends on two things: what your boundary is and the type of pleached effect you want to create. So for example, if it's a fence and therefore there are no foundations, you can go fairly close. I measured ours, and it's 1.5 feet away from the fence line. If it's a wall, then it's probably best to go a little bit further away, certainly at least 2 foot and maybe up to 3 foot, just to avoid foundations. The roots will go deep, and they will get all the rain and the nutrients that they need, but you may need to water them for the first, for the first year or so. The other consideration with spacing also depends on the tree canopy, and we have a 6 foot bare stem, so the branches start at 6 foot, which is above the line. That's where the fence panel ends, so any overhang goes over the fence. So if you are planning on getting that sort of look that we've got with the hornbeam, where it goes quite thick, a bit like a hedge on stilts, then you need to consider that, because if you're not overhanging the fence, the branches will potentially touch it, so you might need to go further away so this doesn't happen. If, on the other hand, you're going to grow them a bit like the trees we saw at Erddig, which were growing just one branch thick, then that's not a consideration, so you could go closer. The width of our hedge, now that the first one is mature, is actually 3 foot wide. So that just gives you some idea. The other question is, how tall are the pleached trees? So as I said, ours are 6 foot bare stem, and then the canopy above that is another 6 foot. Now we did go, I think they're probably about 5 foot canopy when we first bought them, but we did go up another foot. Now if you buy them from a nursery, they tend to come like that, pre-pleached, and they tend to start at 6 foot bare stem. However, if you're going to do it yourself, and going back to the first question about neighbours and things like that, you can adapt it and make it any size that you want. So you could go lower, you could start at a 3 foot bare stem and 5 foot on top of that. So the whole thing, you'd get the look, but the whole thing would be that much lower, which may meet with your neighbour's approval if you agree not to go. I think ours are in total 12 foot. So perhaps if you've got neighbours that don't want that, but they'll happily let you go to say 10 foot, then you can adapt the way you're going to grow them. You could have a shorter bare stem and a shorter canopy, bring the whole thing down, and that might get round a few problems. So that leads us on really well to the next question. The next question was, what are the best trees for pleaching? As I said in the other video, the best and most suitable trees for pleaching must have a relatively short space between the buds to give the density of branches that is required for the pleaching process. The other thing to consider, your chosen tree must be quite a robust variety, because the process of pleaching means that you're going to be doing lots of cuts, and that means that the tree is more likely to get infection until these cuts heal. So trees such as birch or horse chestnut or cherry aren't suitable. Don't even try it with these types of trees. They're not suitable. The most suitable trees can be divided into two categories. So there are evergreen and deciduous trees. The most common choice for trees for pleaching are the two types that we have used in our garden, namely Tilia or lime and Carpinus betulus or hornbeam, both of which are deciduous. The red twigged lime is usually used for this effect. I don't know what ours are. I think ours are just the common lime, and they're quite unfussy plants. They grow well in moist but well-drained soil. They tolerate full sun or partial shade, grow in any aspect or any soil type. Hardiness H6, USDA hardiness 6 through 9. Carpinus betulus or common hornbeam is also pretty tough and will grow in any soil type. It likes moist but well-drained soil in any pH, in full sun or part shade, and in any aspect. Beech too is another popular choice and looks quite similar to hornbeam. There's also the option to use Fagus sylvatica purpurea, which is the purple beech, and would look really lovely too. But the things to consider when choosing between beech and hornbeam are as follows. So hornbeam is usually a bit cheaper. Beech leaves often are thought to be more beautiful than hornbeam, and beech leaves also hang on the branches for longer than hornbeam. In a sunny site, beech is much faster growing. If your site has good drainage and is sheltered and has good amounts of sunshine, use beech. If your site is exposed or cold, as ours is, or is in a frost pocket and has some shade, then go for hornbeam. Ours is in full sun. It's very windy, so that's the reason why I chose hornbeam. If the site is damp or has poor drainage, then you must use hornbeam. Don't try beech. Although hornbeam can cope with damper soils, it doesn't like waterlogged or swamp-like conditions. So we opted for lime and hornbeam. They're both really unfussy plants, and our garden is particularly windy and exposed at times. And because we were new to the whole process at the time, we wanted it to be completely as low risk as possible. We didn't want any failures. We couldn't afford to have any failures. And it was for that reason that we chose Tilia and Carpinus betulus as they're tried and well tested. Now the next question, somebody was asking, what's the best tree, the best variety of tree to use for maximum privacy? They don't want to be overlooked at all. So the two trees that we have got, lime, Tilia, and Carpinus betulus, hornbeam, are both deciduous trees. The lime will lose all of its leaves and be completely bare. And if you're growing it in the way that we saw at Earthig, with the single rows of very distinct lines, that won't give you as much privacy, because even when they have got their leaves on them, especially earlier on in the season, they're quite see-through. You can see through them. So I would avoid lime if privacy is your thing. Hornbeam, a little bit different in that hornbeam will give you a little bit more privacy, and as I say, we've grown them 3 foot wide, so you've got all the branches in the winter. You can see through them a bit, but there are lots of branches in the way, so it's kind of this kind of opaque view through. And they do hold on to some of their leaves, not all of their leaves, but certainly some of them. So for us, it's not a problem because in the winter we're not using our garden nearly as much as we are in the summer. And by the time the summer comes, sort of from May onwards, it's got its leaves and it's dense and thick and you can't see in at all. However, if you really want privacy all times of the year, then the best thing to do is look at evergreen trees. Now, I did a video on the best evergreen trees for your gardens, and some of those I also find made really, really good pleached avenues. So we'll come on to those as well. So my favourite trees for evergreen pleached trees would be Eleagnus ex ebbingei, Photinea and Quercus ilex. Now, another one that's absolutely beautiful is Magnolia grandiflora, and we'll go through each of those one by one. So the first one, Eleagnus ex ebbingei, is a fast growing tree. It likes full sun and well drained soil. It can cope in any soil type, including dry or poor soils. It's a really tough tree and it will cope well with pollution or even a coastal site with salty air and salty soil. Hardiness H5, USDA hardiness 2 through 6. One point to note with this tree is when planting it, don't plant it too deep, as that can be fatal. But other than that, it's a really unfussy tree. And you'll find it grows really, really fast, which can be good in that you get the look very, very quickly. However, the downside of that is that it can require cutting up to 4 times a year if you want to keep it looking really good. So that might be a bit of a bind in the longer term. So think about that before you decide. Photinea, or red robin, it's an evergreen tree. When I say it's evergreen, it's actually in the spring. The new growth comes through bright red, so not green at all, but red. And then as the leaves slowly change to green throughout the course of the year. So it's quite showy, quite a lovely look in the early season. I think pleached Photinea is quite a rare sight. You haven't seen very many at all. I think they're probably best suited to quite a contemporary look and perhaps a more modern garden. I don't personally think they would look right in our garden, but I think in the right setting they would. Now, they like moist but well-drained soil in full sun or partial shade. Another quite tough tree, hardiness H5, USDA 2 through 6. The new juvenile red growth in spring can sometimes get caught by a late spring frost, and therefore just perhaps consider when you're planting it the aspect, so perhaps avoid a north-facing site. It grows best in well-drained, light, sandy soil types and has got the additional benefit of white flowers which appear in April or May. So that's that one. The next one is Quercus ilex, another tough plant, and this one perhaps is a really good one going forward into the future, perhaps as we see our changing climate with hotter, drier summers. It copes really well by the coast and it can cope with salty air also, and also a good tree for city planting as it copes well with pollution. Grow this tree in full sun on any soil type, chalk, clay, loam or sand, but it does like free draining soil. So if growing on clay, you might need to address issues with drainage and make sure the soil is draining really well. It's not quite as hardy as the previous trees mentioned. Hardiness H4, USDA 7 through 10. It becomes more hardy as it gets more mature, but it may require a little shelter when young. I don't know how you would do that on a pleached row, but perhaps avoid again a north-facing site. And the next one is Magnolia grandiflora. I've chosen the variety exmouth purely because it's slightly hardier than other magnolias. So also known as evergreen magnolia or bullbay. If grown in the right conditions, this tree growing as a pleached row has the potential to be absolutely spectacular with these large, highly scented cream flowers which appear in late summer or early autumn. However, choose this plant really carefully, consider your aspect and site very, very well. It's native to southwestern side of the United States, so for you guys it's safe to grow, but for us and for me in Shropshire, and with a windy garden it's certainly not one that I would even contemplate, because I know it wouldn't do well. I did see not pleached road but certainly standard Magnolia grandiflora growing in a garden near here in Cheshire, which is not so far from here. It's a garden that budget wasn't an issue, it being professionally landscaped, designed and planted with great mature trees. Beautiful garden, but sadly the magnolias had been frosted and had just turned brown and were really letting down the whole garden. So here it's too risky and it's not one that I would choose. So if you are growing it, grow it on a southwest or east facing aspect. Definitely avoid north facing. It can be slow to establish here in the UK. Hardiness H4, USDA 7 through 10, but for those of you with the right conditions, I bet this would be a sight to behold, and I'd love to see an example. If any of you have got an example of a pleached magnolia trees, it would be lovely to see that. So all in all, there's a lot to consider, and there's certainly lots to choose from, and something for every situation and every soil type and every aspect. So hope you find this helpful, and if you've got any other questions which I haven't covered in this, just drop me a question in either the comments section here on YouTube or on our Instagram page. So thank you very much for watching, and join us again in the next video. Bye for now.